Welcome back, Carapists. Today, we have a really exciting episode in front of us on burnout, which I know is a topic that we think about and maybe even experience a lot in our field. And I'm so happy to introduce Shaina Siber, LCSW, who is an author on the topic, an educator on the topic, and happens to be the host of her own podcast called Affirming Minds. Welcome, Shaina.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Love you too. So, as you know, I've been deep diving into your book, Using ACT and CFT for Burnout Recovery, the Beyond Burnout Blueprint. And I think it's going to be such an interesting conversation today where we really get to talk about the evidence-based approaches that you've learned about and developed when it comes to burnout.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to get into it. And my own personal relationship with burnout has evolved over the years. And I think kind of utilizing some of these theoretical frameworks to guide my thinking and sort of intervention around it has been really helpful because, we're both social workers. For a long time, I was like, listen, this is our lot in life. We will be burnt out, and almost sort of some of that martyrdom that can be built in our profession, that we're just like part of doing this work well is self-sacrificial in a way. And I'm really glad for my own sustainability because I happen to really love being a social worker and a therapist that I have been able to apply different approaches that I think are going to allow me to do this work much longer and sort of decouple from that early career thinking.
Oh, I think that's such a mouthful that you just said, because some of that really is built in to the framework of our training and then into the careers where we are even maybe conditioned in some ways, for better or worse, to expect this isn't a career path that will pay a lot. You'll have to find the joy in other areas. I remember hearing messages like that in grad school. And then I remember having a boss when I was leaving for supervision purposes. I was needing to get something that this job didn't offer that mentioned, well, these clients need you. It really is baked into some of the work that we're doing to have a bit of martyrdom, probably across disciplines, but in particular in social work.
Absolutely. And like caregiving and helping professions are sort of historically lower compensated in our society, which I think kind of speaks a lot to our values because it doesn't fit neatly into a capitalist system that just sort of looks at outputs and profits and productivity that kind of grow in that way. And yet we are still embedded in healthcare and helping professionals within this capitalist system. So how do you get people to do this emotional labor at scale? Well, you make them feel like their morality is tied up in it. And I think that's a lot of what social workers, therapists, teachers, anybody in healthcare really is sort of has this sort of complex and loaded relationship with burnout that is one guided through the lens of capitalism, but also how our morality and self-worth gets very intrinsically tied into doing the work.
That's so interesting. For anybody kind of thinking about burnout for the first time, how would you summarize it? How do you look at it and what does it look like?
Yeah. So, the technical definition that was sort of, I oftentimes default to the World Health Organization definition of burnout, just to sort of have some shared language, although I have, my own I think it has its own limitation, is when we're talking about burnout, specifically occupational burnout, we're really looking at it as an occupational phenomenon. It is not categorized as a mental health condition or a medical syndrome, but core symptoms or characterizations are dimensions of exhaustion and energy depletion, increased distance or negativity or cynicism related to one's work, and reduced professional efficiency. So again, we kind of have to conceptualize this from burnout is oftentimes when we have historically been looking at burnout is when people become less productive at their jobs. And we miss a lot of people that are suffering with burnout symptoms. in their occupational context. And we see this all the time with really high achieving professions like physicians, where they have amongst the highest rates of completed suicides, but oftentimes aren't getting support around burnout because their productivity and their work performance are very rarely the last things, if at all, impacted, even though they're significantly suffering. So the way I sort of have come to see it over the years of doing this work is that burnout is a likely outcome of a person's attempt to function or conserve energy in the context of chronic occupational stress. And it kind of reflects our attempts to adaptively respond and to sustain our occupational demands and pressures, but frequently has these negative impacts on our mental, physical, and relational health and well-being over time. And certainly, burnout happens at really high rates. Different studies shows different things, but many indicate that at least 3/4 of the workforce will have burnout at some point in their lives. But certainly things like the type of job that you have, the work environment and culture, and your own personal trauma history, physical and emotional health may impact your vulnerability to experiencing burnout and the severity of that burnout experience.
Something that you said really jumped out with the examples that I've seen, which is the relational element. And the physician example was a really powerful one because I think I see that in our colleagues as well, that a client may never see burnout in their therapist, but the people that will might be friends, family. I've heard examples of people responding out in the community on a holiday or on a weekend in a way that they later checked in and said, that wasn't me. I would want to help that person, or I would have wanted to listen and hear their story. And I just didn't have the capacity for that because I've left it all at work.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are some of the systemic drivers that have been found to contribute to burnout?
So Christina Maslach, who's the premier researcher on burnout and has been doing burnout research since the 70s, identified 6 systemic drivers of burnout that I think really sort of stand the test of time and are deeply relevant today, even as sort of our workspaces can evolve in terms of emerging technologies and things like that. So first being overwork or work overload. So when expectations, volume, and pace are not sustainable, that is a significant driver of burnout significantly, as well as health problems and even increased risk of mortality. So we see when people are just from a time perspective, when people are working more than 55 hours a week, deaths go up in terms of risk of stroke, heart attack, things like that. But certainly things like overwork and workload are a huge issue that I think we always need to be talking about in terms of burnout. The next is lack of job autonomy. So when people do not feel like they have meaningful influence of the how, when, and what they're doing at work, and where now today in our modern context, when we think about when there is flexibility around remote work and things like that, that is also something that can be a hidden risk for burnout. And then the converse can be protective, right? So if lack of job autonomy is a risk factor, then more autonomy is typically a protective factor. Another one is lack of reward. So we're really thinking about both recognition and compensation, which I think in burnout conversations, we historically really underemphasize the importance of monetary compensation. We don't talk about if people are being paid appropriately to meet their level of sufficiency they need to live well. And many people in our country we know don't, as cost of living increases and wages sort of stagnate behind. So certainly a lot of this is recognition through verbal acknowledgement, appreciating people, supporting people, promoting people. But also, I think we really have to talk about compensation in this country, because when people are living in poverty or poverty adjacent conditions while working. There's not like no pizza parties, no wellness programs are really going to be able to supersede the physiological and health impacts of that. So another one is that sort of lack of reward. Lack of community is another one. So is there community and connection? Do people experience support and trust and a sense of belonging at work? Do they feel like they can work with people effectively? All of those good things. And it's way more nuanced and complex than just like sending everybody back into the office and having everybody in the same physical space. We've had burnout predates any of the more modern kind of hybrid and remote work contexts. And lack of community is something that has often plagued different work communities in a big way. The next one is a lack of fairness. So it really is troubling to see how much bullying and harassment still happens in modern day work environments. This really increases in risk for marginalized folks. So whether that be gender minorities, racial minorities, or other people that have marginalization related to body size, things like ableism, etc., that bullying and harassment are still chronic workplace issues that really need to be addressed and eradicated in healthy work cultures in meaningful ways. Because even if someone is not being directly bullied or harassed, even being exposed to bullying or harassment in the workplace increases burnout risks for other members of the community. So it really is like a contagion when we think of burnout when bullying and harassment is happening. So even when there aren't those like really malignant bullying and harassment, even lack of fairness, like favoritism and lack of transparency can also be under that sort of broad umbrella of lack of fairness and can contribute to increased burnout risk in the work culture and community. And then the last one is a mismatch of values. So that can be, the work being misaligned with people's deeply held personal values. And at an extreme, we're seeing more and more in the literature about moral injury. So this was first conceptualized in military context of when people were asked to do things through their service that directly compromise sort of their deeply held moral and ethical values. So, but we have historically now been seeing this. We have been seeing this more recently, rather, in healthcare contexts and other professional settings. I think right now in the political climate, we're seeing this a lot, that people are literally resigning all in different, states, areas of government agencies because they're being asked to do things that are, morally compromising and feel like they are at, they're being challenged in that way. And everybody is different states of privilege. So when people are being asked to things to do and their livelihood depends on it, it's not always accessible to do the thing of saying, I'm just not going to participate or I'm going to leave this job. So one, I want to just say that as a call out. When people do that, take that courageous step, we should really be as a community supporting them and uplifting them. But we have to also recognize that moral injury is happening in all sorts of work environments. And how do we acknowledge that and indicate that? A lot of my burnout recovery work really got my curiosity really peaked at the height of COVID. And we saw this for many, many people during the height of COVID, for frontline healthcare workers who felt really morally compromised of sort of being thrown into this treatment environment with very little knowledge or resource in how to effectively manage the pandemic. And that caused not just burnout, but moral injury. We're finding more and more almost has symptoms that can mirror post-trauma symptoms. So things like deep shame, anger, intrusive thoughts, nightmares, recurring symptoms, hypervigilance, things like that. So something we definitely want to be cognizant of. But even if there's not something that reaches the height of moral injury, like I think for me as a social worker, I have just had times where I felt like I was being asked to see too many high-risk clients, that it didn't feel safe or it didn't feel appropriate. And those sorts of things could feel morally compromising. Or perhaps I had to I'm a mandated reporter, and I had to make a report that I felt in my bones like I was required to do to maintain my license, but felt like would do more harm than good to a family. Like those are sort of some of the ethical and moral dilemmas that can come up all the time in professional settings.
Yeah, I'd like to spend a little bit of time kind of thinking through some examples of each too. But you're right, this field in particular is so full of ethical dilemmas where both choices sometimes feel suboptimal.
Yeah.
And that was a great example. I think I hear that a lot from colleagues, but also associate licensed professionals or interns in the field, that they know in their bones that they won't get to see that client again once they make the report. And holding in the other hand, they know that they're sure that from their ethical board's perspective, they need to make that report.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Sort of stepping back, that like rules and regulations are often met with like good intention, but their applications, when they're done rigidly, can be really, really complicated. And we run into that all the time, where we have these systemic challenges and we kind of often have that conversation that we're working within broken systems. And how do we work within broken systems in ways where we can still show up fully as ourselves and feel like that we are practicing in ways that feel aligned with our values? And that's sort of a lot of the work that I wind up doing, especially with people in these healthcare spaces, and then increasingly things even like legal spaces and other things like that kind of really have these like systemic challenges deeply embedded in them.
Yeah, so true. I think it'll be helpful for us to talk a bit more about that too, because some of these perceived challenges in a singular workplace really do start from a really macro lens. And so some of the things that people hope and wish could be changed in their small office are actually coming down from insurance, some different systems that I think it'll be important to talk about. With our profession specifically, when you were talking about rewards, I was thinking about the reward of clinical supervision toward licensure, and how sometimes that can be one of the agreements that a person makes with their employer when they're signing on. And then for whatever reason, that ends up not being sufficient, or the supervisor with the correct discipline for supervision leaves the agency, or they end up not maintaining their supervision credential or whatever it is. So you've expected and maybe made compromises in other areas of the job, and then this main reason for signing on ends up not coming to fruition or being available.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, certainly speaks to a lack of reward, but also a lack of fairness, right? So like when we sort of are going and we're sort of already making concessions to try to, I guess, think with that long-term thinking of like, okay, well, how do I use this opportunity to support and move as like forward as a professional, and maybe at least set myself up to be well supervised and then be compensated further in the future because I've gained all these like skills and I'm moving towards my independent licensure or whatever the goals are. Like those things can feel deeply, deeply, sort of like a deep injury, of course.
Mm. And then I was thinking too, when you were talking about a lack of positive feedback, or when the feedback doesn't amount, this is a sign I'm on the right track for this promotion or this raise or this thing. And then those things never come. So it feels like a clarification and a transparency about what to expect and when.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that's a really good, point, because when I was sort of at the height of my burnout, some of this like overwork was self-inflicted. I did a lot of like striving to prove myself and prove my worth and prove my value. A lot of people pleasing and like personal boundary violations and volunteering for things, just sort of like taking on more to prove my worth and value, in some ways hoping that I would get consideration for improved compensation and, promotions and things like that. I got a lot of attaboys. I got a lot of like, wow, you're doing great. You're doing amazing. Fantastic. Keep up the good work. But a couple things can happen there. One, in that overwork, if we are doing it with that sort of need for approval or need for a validation, it could sort of be like an endless well where even if I was getting praised, it was very easy to like kind of minimize it with any perceived negative feedback or not being considered. And it did not amount to me being treated fairly in terms of compensation and other mechanisms, even when I did get promoted. And I think it also shifted expectation, meaning like the more I did voluntarily, the higher the expectation norm became for me. And then I sort of like worked myself up into a frenzy that I couldn't meet my own internal expectations that I had created. So a lot of times we can do that if we don't have boundaries and we overwork beyond it. Instead of being like getting all of this acknowledgement for extended effort, what happens is there's a slow drift of expectations where that becomes a new normal. And I think that has happened in our field, right? Where, in community mental health, like the caseloads people are seeing today would have not ever been considered 20 years ago. There's just like a slow drift of more and more and more. But sometimes these are also self-inflicted. And that's also a lot of the work that I'm doing is like when we are getting curious about why we sometimes contribute to our own burnout dynamics in this way. A lot of it is systemically driven, but then there is also a participation piece where we are sort of have a relationship with some of these systems that can be oppressive, that can amplify our suffering in certain cases.
Oh, I think that's such a great point. Everyone knew that they could count on you for certain things. And if this is not about you, obviously, but if an employer is looking for a different metric for promotion, they're accepting all of that work, but maybe they're looking for something that you're not even aware of. But that agreement where a therapist could be working themselves into the ground and the employer is allowing it or lightly saying, oh, you don't have to do that. But they're looking for something completely different that the therapist hasn't had an opportunity to show yet or doesn't even know that the employer might be looking for. I'm thinking like specific leadership skills or specific clinical judgment, things like that. When the person thinks they're proving what they need to prove by just taking on so many extra clients, staying beyond the hours that are recommended, leading up projects, things like that. But the employer the whole time has been looking for something else that they haven't been clear that they'd be looking for.
Right, absolutely. And that's what I'm thinking a lot about with burnout is patterns, right? And especially what are the reactive patterns, the patterns we're kind of engaging in without much thought. To me, it wasn't a thought of like being the first person to volunteer. But for me, it wasn't a thought to say yes instead of no to things. It was happening reflexively.
Yeah.
And oftentimes with burnout, we really are in these autonomic nervous system loops that detach us from intentionally choosing in any given moment, what our next choice is, what the next step is, and connecting that to some sort of bigger mission or connection to sort of what our why is when it comes to our professional work and identities.
Yeah, I think that it just in my own practice, this is an issue that I talk about a lot with the high achievers that I work with, because some of that automatic response is coming on so early in life.
Yeah.
It's such a sophisticated response method to get a need met starting so early that I think you explain that so exquisitely that of course that feels automatic and necessary through the whole trajectory because it's developed really early for a lot of people.
Yeah, and it's so interesting you say that because when I first became a therapist, I really wanted to work with adult survivors of childhood trauma. And as I got through, kind of moved into this burnout work, maybe there was like the slightest thought was like, am I departing from that? And I would say not at all, because what happens in our professional lives, and I work with people in the United States. I imagine many people tuning in might be practicing or living in the United States. There's this kind of twofold process. One, we spend so much of our adult lives working. So it's the average American, it's something like 90,000 hours. So well more than 1/3 of our waking hours of our adult lives, more than most of us will spend with our partners, with our friends, with our children in many cases, right? So a lot of our lives are connected to our work. It's also a very American concept, that our work is who we are. It becomes sort of synonymous. So people ask like, what do you do, as almost like a interchangeable question of like, who are you? Like, what are you about? What is it that you do in this world? Right. Which if you go to other countries, like you could go through a dinner party and like be introduced to someone and that never comes up because it is not as centered as it is in our US westernized concept and relationship with work, which is very work centric into our identity. So when we spend a lot of time somewhere, when it's critical to our survival, for most Americans, that if they miss 1 or 2 paychecks, for most people, it's very difficult to have long-term survival. And there's these power dynamics of being employed where your relationship with the employer will have a lot to do with your daily work experience and your livelihood. It can pull up all of that stuff from our childhood in terms of our attachment, how we navigate complex social dynamics really maps onto a lot of our childhood experiences. So a lot of the people that I work with that are struggling with burnout, they are oftentimes trauma survivors, and they really often fall into this fawning response where they were oftentimes survivors of persistent trauma, meaning they were exposed to some sort of chronic neglect, abuse, complex in childhood, where it wasn't like a one and done experience. It was something where their attachment was, kind of wrapped up in their survival, that they had to have a relationship in some sort of oppressive system or abusive relationship to survive. So a lot of people learn to fawn, to acquiesce to a system, to try to please caregivers, and then later bosses or the system at large, to be accepted, to survive, to function well. So a lot of the people that I work with at least some point in their burnout journey are engaging in some sort of over functioning. So, sort of overachieving, rushing, overscheduling themselves, never feeling enough, sort of chronic vigilance or anxiety, or that fawning of like appeasement, people pleasing, poor boundaries, subjugating their own needs for other people, feeling responsible for other people's needs, and codependency patterns. And this really comes up in the work of burnout.
It's similar to attachment that we see in relationships where you expect, oh, I don't want that kind of attachment anymore. You would expect that a system would seek out a more helpful, secure attachment, but instead, often our systems seek out something familiar. And so it makes a lot of sense that we enter into the workplace, the relationship we have with our work in the same way, a way that feels familiar, a way that feels in some cases abusive, or that we're taken advantage of because we feel it's familiar enough to navigate, rather than maybe being automatically able to, on instinct, select something that allows our nervous system to sort of relax.
Absolutely.
Can you talk about how you apply CFT or compassion-focused therapy in your lens of looking at burnout?
Sure, absolutely. So compassion-focused therapy is a therapeutic model that was developed by Paul Gilbert in the 2000s. And what he was essentially finding is he was doing cognitive behavioral therapy and finding it to be effective in many cases, but was struggling with individuals that had high levels of shame and self-criticism. So even when they could do some exposure work, even when they could do some cognitive, that was not necessarily getting at their felt experience in relationships to their thoughts. So they could say things like, yeah, I know it's stupid to look at it like that. I know that when I go to the gym, nobody else is thinking about me. But it was still almost like either not touching the shame or self-criticism or activating it. So he wanted to look at how we can help people generate self-supportive inner voices and have a felt sense of compassion. So he created compassion-focused therapy, which is one grounded in attachment theory, looking at sort of our wiring around attachment, and also on a growing body of neuroscientific evidence that demonstrated our affiliative motives and emotions can have a major impact on self and our affect regulation. So essentially the part of our mammalian drives that are wired for connection in relationships and feelings of soothing and safety, that how could we leverage those to help soothe our emotions. So he essentially proposed a biological framework for compassion. And he talks about our evolutionary system. He talks about these old and new brain systems, that we have this sort of reptilian parts of our brain that are our brain stem and our basic survival that were developed 500 to 600 million years ago, and this mammalian brain that's more of our limbic system, and the attachment I was just describing that is 150 million years ago in our evolutionary history. And that part of our brain is wired for survival. It keeps you alive. It ensures the survival of our species. It connects us to care about our own imminent survival. And it's very fast, and it's very automatic, and it's very reflexive, but it's really rooted to keep us reproducing as a species. And then we have this newer part of our brain that's only evolved in the last 3 million years or so, that is our neocortex, our prefrontal cortex, that does all of this higher level thinking and reflecting. And it helps us plan, it helps us make meaning, it helps us create art and build cities, and not just think about reproducing for the future, but sustaining for the future. It's more slow, it's more deliberate, but it also can function in very, very tricky ways with our old system. So we have this old programming and these new programming that's sort of lopped on top of each other. And the way they interact, instead of working seamlessly together, they can interact in tricky ways that get us trapped in rumination, in comparison, in self-criticism, and we can get us trying to think harder to deal with issues of threat, right? Because we're so good at anticipating threat that we can almost feel like it's happening in the here and now. So he uses this sort of tricky brain as a way to normalize our struggle, right? That many of the shame and self-criticism are not coming because we are deserving of shame or self-criticism, but are functions of this very tricky brain that are trying to protect us from rejection and humiliation, and alienation from social groups, which are all things that are central to our human need to belong.
CFT is not a modality that we've talked about or even uncovered at all on Self-Care Post so far. So I think it's really neat to have the information that if people want to learn more about it, they can. Also, in your burnout recovery approach, you integrate ACT as well.
Yeah, I think psychological flexibility winds up being a lot of the model, a lot of the practical interventions that we do. But where compassion-focused therapy, I think, has become so important for me personally and the work that I do with my clients is understanding something called the 3 systems of emotional regulation that was proposed by Paul Gilbert, which he basically says we have 3 primary emotional drives. And one is our threat system. So this is the part of our experience where that is really built for threat detection and protection. So that's sort of better safe than sorry, operates from that amygdala, that threat response part of our brain. When we are in threat, we produce things like adrenaline and cortisol, and feelings associated with threat are things like anxiety, anger, and disgust. And threat is probably the most dominant system. It's like if we feel that we're in imminent danger, it puts us on alert to protect ourselves. And it is fundamentally important. The next system is the drive system. So that is the part of our minds that are motivate us towards resource allocation. So, there's no predators. Now I'm going out for food, water, shelter. In our modern day society, it's like, let me go earn my paycheck, let me go get a job, let me go get a partner, let me go on a date, let me go do these dopamine seeking activities. Both of these things are essential to our short-term survival, right? Like we need to be able to protect ourselves from imminent threat, and we need to be able to go out and get what we need to function and survive in the world. But when we're burnt out, we're often stuck between threat and drive. And a lot of our threat and drive is also tied up in our social status, but their threat system gets activated from daily modern stressors. Like they open an email that feels threatening to them and they convince themselves they're going to get fired, right? And that adrenaline and cortisol starts activating through their body because of that tricky brain. And their drive system kind of kicks in of like, I got to send this email back and I got to do all of these reports to show that I'm good and I'm worthy and all of these other things. So burnout really gets us in this threat and drive. And what's often neglected is this third system for emotional regulation, which is our soothing system, which is how we need to manage distress, promote bonding and feelings of safety and connection, vital to our long-term survival. And this is oftentimes what we're pushing away and we're not addressing, which is this part of us that feels content, safe, protected, cared for, feels trusting in relation, that feels satisfied with ourselves, that can feel feelings of compassion. And that's where we kind of associate those experiences of like oxytocin and endorphins. Again, this is our prefrontal cortex that's contributing to this. Now, what happens often is when we're feeling threatened, we use drive as a way to try to get rid of that adrenaline and cortisol, but that's not actually how our systems work. We really need that oxytocin and endorphins to downregulate our threat response. So many people that I work with, they're feeling threatened at work, they're feeling less than, they're feeling insecure, they're feeling worthless, they're feeling really scared about the future. And they do things like even really well-intentioned things that holistically are good for their health, like go to an orange theory class, right? Or, go have a glass of wine or go, work on a paper that they're supposed to do. None of those things are inherently wrong, but none of them are going to necessarily downregulate their threat system. So we have to really almost teach people in this capitalist society how to activate their soothing system. And one of the most effective way to do that is compassion. Compassion actually releases oxytocin, endorphins, serotonin, helps reduce cortisol, and activates and reduces the sympathetic activation. So it slows down our heart rate. It does all of these things that interrupt cycles of shame and self-criticism. So teaching compassion as a skill has been a really wonderful balance to this other work of psychological flexibility and ACT, where we teach people to be with these difficult emotional inner experiences and emotions, and then take action steps towards their, highly cherished values.
I just want everyone to know that this book is like part workbook. Shaina, you have so many prompts that someone can really do to get to know their own process. I think to actually be able to work through and answer the questions that you've posed and integrate the language that you've included is going to be really integral for anybody that wants to really get to know their burnout more clearly.
That was my hope, is that people could read the book either as a therapist, using this as an adjunct in therapy to support your clients through some exercises that you want to do to really target burnout recovery, but certainly also for the reader to just work through this as you're doing it and giving yourself some, tools and strategies to help build your capacity, but also get clarity about, what's important for you, and kind of creating a work life that feels meaningful to you.
Can you start with the first step of compelling vision brainstorm in the blueprint?
Sure. So where we start is creating a compelling vision. And why this is really important to me is, as I was mentioning, oftentimes when we are burnt out, we're in autopilot, right? That we're all the time like sort of stuck in these loops of autonomic responsiveness, which means that we are responding to evade feelings of threat rather than to move towards something, meaningful. So we're choosing behaviors to avoid emotional experiences rather than choosing behaviors to move in the direction of something that is valuable to us. So part of creating a compelling vision is start with the end in mind and say, what is it that we're creating for our lives? And that can certainly include achievements that you want to have. It can include money I would want to make to feel resourced and sufficient and things like that. But also, like, how do you want to feel every day? What kind of relationships do you want to have? What kind of impact do you want to make on the world and the people around you? What kind of relationship do you want to have with work and then the rest of your life? When you come home from work, what do you want that to look like? Do you want to have more freedom or time with your children or your friends, or really getting granular about like what am I actually desiring? And what's really important right now is a lot of people are not in a situation where they can necessarily leave their jobs. And for many, many years, the idea was like, oh, if people like, you're not happy, you leave your job, and then like your burnout is sort of cured. And, in 2022, we've had things like the Great Resignation where millions of people left their job, and it has not had a meaningful impact on the rates of burnout. Even for many people that left during the Great Resignation, try to get their jobs back. So really an implication that like oftentimes escaping your job is not sufficient to, get rid of your burnout. We do a lot of brainstorming to figure out what is the life you're trying to create and why. And even if you can't leave now, there's something about tying the thread of what's happening in your current job experience to that greater vision. You're always building towards it. I listen to a lot of business and personal development podcasts, and you'll hear these like 100 millionaires that have built these like, social entrepreneurial businesses, and they'll talk about being a valet driver or being a waiter and how that was the best job they ever had in their lives because it taught them how to talk to people, or they were able to connect with people. And to me, that's the strength of a vision, is it doesn't necessarily matter about your current circumstances. You can see the vision in everything. You can see how everything you're doing now is moving you in the direction of the life that you're building. And if it's not, it gives you the ability to stop and be intentional and pivot so that you are moving in that direction. So does it mean your life is going to be devoid of challenging things? And, I talk about in the book, like, notes are still very much like the bane of my existence. I hate writing clinical notes, but what helps me is connecting them to my broader vision, that being able to accept insurance, to, continue to be a therapist, that being able to see this as like part of that meaningful whole, that like seeing everything as connected to that broader vision. And we do this all the time outside of work, right? If you have a dog, for example, you kind of accept that you are going to maybe have like accidents on the carpet and a chewed up slipper, and you're going to have vet bills, and your dog is going to probably die a lot sooner than you are, because the vision of having that connection and bonding and going, playing fetch with them and taking them to the beach and bonding with them is so compelling to you that you can take the difficulty as part of that meaningful. So creating that compelling vision is about understanding what you want, why you want it, and having it be centered in your daily experience of work.
I love that in the long term, it can keep you on the path, but in the short term, it offers you something to check against to see, am I saying yes because it's just natural for me, or am I saying yes because this is going to contribute to the outcome of how I'm able to reach my vision at some point?
Absolutely. Yeah. And the other pairing of that is having a vision with having a relationship with your compelling vision that's compassionate. Because I work with a lot of people that are very, very ambitious. So maybe that they have a vision, but then they use that vision as a yardstick. So everything is negatively compared to in their current reality, that they're not there yet. And it becomes like a source of shame and self-criticism. So it's having the vision and then using that vision as a source of inspiration and connection and drive versus something that becomes a tool to compare yourself against, right? That we are always coming and leaning and living into a vision of the life we want versus we are only enough. We are only going to be happy when we are in that state of achievement, because I've seen so many people that are high achievers, they get what they want and they have like 10 minutes of contentment around it before they're like, it didn't make me feel like the way I wanted it to feel. And I would say these aspirations that aren't rooted to more of a vision of how you want your life to feel and the kind of person you want to be, which critically like is a part of it, your identity, not just having things, not like just racking up achievement, is a big part of it.
Yeah, I think that is such an important distinction of setting a meaningful goal with healthy striving versus just on the grind for the sake of the grind.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. The second step is welcome the unwanted. So that's really about willingness and which is, a concept that's related to acceptance and commitment therapy. So it's sort of making space and being with those difficult emotions that we may be evading, whether that's fear of rejection, anxiety, inadequacy, anything you are trying to get rid of or evade. Like, how do you make space to be with it? So mindfulness, increasing your capacity and being with the difficulties of your life in a way where you can make space with them without being controlled by them. Control strategies are a lot about what happens with burnout. It's like all these things we're doing to try to get rid of unwanted feelings. And it's about sort of, unlocking yourself from that. The third step is watch your words. So we talk about sort of the paradox of language and how language can have so much to do with narrating our experiences. So it's trying to do compassionate word swaps for things that can really get us kind of stuck in these verbal traps that can exacerbate stress. Like, I should be doing this. I need to be doing this. Like, these things that can inadvertently increase shame and urgencies and kind of do some other ways of languaging things that can be helping, but also things like venting, complaining, and reassurance seeking, which is kind of like the trifecta in burnout, like emotional processing, and
Yeah.
figuring out ways to like move towards self-advocacy, move towards support seeking without getting into these verbal ways of processing that can get us a little bit more stuck.
Oh, I think this is so important. It can get us stuck. It can get our colleagues stuck. I think about starting at a community mental health, decades ago, really. And the culture was sort of that we all complained and that we all vented, and there was humor in it. But I think now sometimes about what it might have been like if any one of us had had more of a forward, motivating stance and how it could have shaped the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm a recovering ventaholic. I definitely was a person who relied a lot on venting. And one thing that's really interesting is a little bit of venting does actually produce oxytocin. So there's like a little bit of social bonding that actually helps with like connection and feelings of belongingness. But like anything else, the dose makes the poison. So if you are reflexively and chronically venting, instead of getting that nice like oxytocin release where you feel validated and connected and understood and heard, you start to like rev yourself up and work yourself up and more into these unworkable, rigid perspectives of what's happening that you can't see yourself beyond, right? Like I would definitely like, I would have this big vent about like, oh, I'm a workhorse and I'm not respected as much as other people. They want me to do a little work, but I'm not as prestigious as other people, and I'm not being, and even when things would happen that would counter that narrative, because I was speaking it into existence so much, like it wouldn't really penetrate even when alternative experiences were actually happening. So being able to kind of recognize that and say like, well, what do you need, right? Like we are not talking about not complaining, and I think this is particularly important for marginalized folks. Women of color are always having to deal with that. Like anytime they're speaking out, they're being penalized for using their voice, right? And so I don't want this to be sort of interpreted as like telling people to silence themselves, right? Tone policing, encouraging people to acquiesce or anything like that. It's really about being intentional. And it's also about being connected to what's actually happening in your emotional state, in your physiology, and, just kind of making sure the things that you're doing that are these creative survival strategies to get through the day are actually having the impact that you're hoping they will.
There's that darn mindfulness
Right, I
of
know.
just being aware of, we chatted for this long and that felt so good. I felt really held and understood. And then when I've chatted for 30 minutes instead of 15, I started to be on the other side of that slope where now I start to feel kind of, I feel mad. I feel more like irritable. I leave feeling a little, and just being sort of mindful and aware of where that balance is for each individual, it sounds like.
100%. Like, where's the tipping point for you, and being able to make sure that like you have some awareness of that. Absolutely.
Okay. Step 4, identify your unique strengths.
Yeah. So identifying your strengths or your gifts, I think is, I get a little bit into that particular chapter, incorporating some like positive psychology research about, flourishing and like building on strengths and things like that. But why I think it's really, really important is that burnout is certainly about like assessing things like workload and, making sure that we're not doing too much. But it's also about doing things that feel like are aligned with our unique contributions, our unique aptitudes, where we can kind of participate in ways that feel meaningful, and giving ourselves the space to explore what our gifts and contributions are. The other reason that I think, which is a little bit of a, like the paradox here, is the more we can be connected to our unique strengths, the less that we have to be good at everything. And perfectionism is something that plagues so many people, that they feel like they have to be all things to all people, that they have to be good at everything, that it's not acceptable to not be good at something, to make a mistake, to not have a strength. And another thing that works against compassion and our ability to activate that soothing system is highly competitive environments, right? And capitalism like runs on competition, right? Like that, those two things are intrinsically linked. So the more we are in touch with our gifts and the more we can lean into and explore our gifts, the less I have to be in competition with my colleague, because I can also start to notice and observe their gifts, and I can start to name and honor what they do well. And therefore, I don't have to be better than them at everything. I don't have to never make a mistake in front of them, for God forbid that I, show any vulnerability, because I can kind of uniquely understand what I'm good at. And what we want to ultimately do is try to see if there are opportunities, and like obviously not every job setting is the same, that you could take up more space doing the things that you're truly gifted in, at your place of employment, right? Because so sometimes like doing more of what you love is also an antidote to burnout, right? Not just doing less, but doing more of the things that make us feel in flow, that make us feel meaningful and purposeful, that give us a sense of contentment or connection or challenge, right? Like we're not always avoiding challenge. So it could be things like, if you work at a group practice, like talking to the group practice owner about having certain types of referrals, sent your way that you have a lot of curiosity about working with, or that you feel like you're particularly well suited to do. I think other people often like ask for permission to be invited into certain opportunities. And I think identifying your unique gifts is also being able to identify your strengths and communicate them to others. What would it be like to say, I actually think I'm a really strong writer, or I think I'm a really good speaker. Are there opportunities to write a newsletter for this practice? Are there opportunities to do some sort of teaching or speaking gig for this practice? And, there's not a guarantee that everything's going to be yes, but I think a lot of people, when they are not connected to their own strengths, they're waiting for other people to validate their strengths, to name their strengths, to anoint them and say what they're doing is valuable. And I think this can be a much better use of your time and energy, is for you to communicate your strength outwards.
I love that. I'd also posit that that's exactly what makes a meaningful referral network among independent therapists too. When one person can identify and be really clear on their strengths, then you leave room for other people to shine in other areas, rather than, feeling forced to take any client, you knowing that you have built a community where each individual has identified a strength.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're in a woman-dominated profession, and we get a lot of social conditioning about it not being appropriate, like about humility to a fault. And a lot of us in work environments truly do ourselves a disservice because we feel so much discomfort saying that we're good at things, or saying
Yeah.
that we could be good at things, or saying that we want an opportunity. So I feel really strongly that uh, sort of cultivating the skill in therapists and beyond is really, really critical.
Okay. Um, Number 5.
Sure. Be kind to yourself and others. So this is where I really get into some of that nitty-gritty of um, self-compassion. We talk about and compassion that sort of flows outwards, talking about the work of Kristin Neff,
Mhm.
sort of the restorative and fierce compassion, called like the yin and yang of compassion. This idea that compassion can both be soft and nurturing, but also can be things like self-advocacy and resistance, and all sorts of things. So that component I think is really important. I talk also about foundational self-care. So these like kind of basics of things that we know are kind of the building blocks of taking care of our physical bodies and our mental state, like drinking water, eating nutrient dense foods to the extent that's available to us, and moving our bodies and getting exposure to natural sunlight. I think those things are really, really important. There's a lot of systemic barriers that prevent people from being able to participate in those things. And I think we have to societally address that and acknowledge that and work through that with clients and ourselves. If what are the barriers to acting on them, right? Because I think a lot of people know what to do, and there's a lot of internalized shame for not doing them, when I think there's much broader societal explanations that make it difficult for people to take care of themselves. And also taking care of yourself in a way that is fused with a self-respect, versus a self-hatred. I see, to me, somebody who is running on a treadmill 60 minutes telling themselves that they hate their body and they have to lose 15 pounds to be acceptable, that is not an action of self-care to me. That is an action of punishment, right? So
Yeah.
it's not just the behavior, it's our relationship to any given behavior. A lot of our concepts of self-care are very driven on consumption, right? And like consumerism is like the sister of capitalism, of like we need all of these like things and products and experiences to be happy. Consumerism or consumption could be certainly part of like a self-care repertoire of behaviors. But I think that we over rely on it, and thinking about things like self-care habits that we could build into our system that uh focus on rest, focus on connection,
Connection.
yeah, and meaningful pursuits. So doing things that, really make us feel purposeful. Like one of the acts of self-care that I've done is like go to protests, right? That has been meaningful to me. That has made me, and it's not what we think about when we think about like traditional self-care practices. And the last one being sort of presence. How are we working in these things? And in the book, I go on like those different sort of domains of self-care actually activate different hormones and neurotransmitters in your body, right? So you have an internal system for healing and self-regulation that we have to recognize how to activate. And the compassion to others piece is like also things like that you wouldn't always think are like in a burnout recovery book, like forgiveness, working with difficult people, how to show up with like compassion, and repair in interpersonal difficulties. A lot of people's burnout experiences is very interpersonally driven, like,
Mhm.
relational stress at work and beyond. Um, and then lastly, letting your values take the wheel, which is like, how do we it's not possible to be intentional 100% of the time, right? Like it's a good thing that we run on autopilot and we automate a lot of the habits and experiences we have. But I think being able to figure out how to take committed action steps behaviorally to live out our values and the things that are deeply meaningful to us is important. And also knowing how to prioritize, how to, recalibrate. Oftentimes, when we're choosing something to do something, it means we're not choosing something else. And most of us have a lot of competing priorities. Like, I'm a parent, I'm a business owner, I'm a therapist, financial responsibilities, and all of those things are important to me. And I think sometimes it can be really hard to figure out how to prioritize, and that overwhelm can paralyze people and shut people down. Like, they can never do right. They're always disappointing something, or some ball is always dropping. So it's learning how to act on our values, but also, figuring out how to like compassionately prioritize, knowing that we can always choose again, and how to collaborate when we inevitably get off course. Like, we will, like, any given day, I'm not 100% in values alignment, but I've gotten a lot better about recognizing when I'm off course and, kind of getting myself back on track. And I have some strategies to support people through that.
Yeah, great example. I'm so glad people have some access to this information for themselves, perhaps, but also for their clients. If you were the owner of a small or large business where you had employees, what would be a couple of things that you would implement to be able to support people from reaching burnout?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So one thing that I would really get familiar with is psychological safety. How do you make an environment psychologically safe? How do you make it trauma informed? So there is research that has showed that they were looking at a group of doctors and teams of like who was the most productive, who were the most like collaborative teams, who was getting the most done. And they were really, really floored that the team that made the most progress, was accomplishing the most, was the team that made the most mistakes. And this is the researcher who really coined the term psychological safety that did this research. And she's like, well, that's kind of weird. Like, that, why would that be? And when she sort of really investigated, it wasn't necessarily that that team was making the most mistakes. It was that that team had the most safety to give feedback to the leaders when they didn't know something, to say if they were overwhelmed and stressed out, to say if they needed help, to ask questions, to admit failures. And the more safe the environment was, the more that team got done. And the teams that were not able to do that, it wasn't that those mistakes weren't happening, it's just that people couldn't say anything. And then therefore there was no recalibration, there was no pivoting, there was no support, there was no connection. So nobody is going to be a perfect leader to a group of people. You're hiring strangers that you're basically kind of getting from a CV. What you're going to take all of these humans with different nervous systems, different capacities, different lived experience, and you have to learn how to get a team of different people to work best together. So the best way to do that is create trauma-informed workspaces that the environment, the relationships are safe, and that people can talk to you and you can be in a constant state of optimizing, making things work better for people. I think also understanding that when people are burnt out, not like being wary not to put the onus completely on them to correct it. I think sometimes when people are coming in, it's like, what are you doing in terms of self-care to deal with your burnout?
Yeah.
And we want to kind of make sure there is, of course, like, we all have personal responsibility and like how we show up and care for ourselves. But I think kind of creating some space that there's a relationship in a work environment, and a leader and the person who is working there. So I think one strategy that is always something I'm thinking about as someone who's an employer is evaluating workloads, right? So if I'm adding something new, what am I taking away, right? Like, if I am, how am I assigning what's a reasonable amount of work? Am I evaluating if people will have time to stop, use the restroom, do their paperwork? How am I incorporating like who is like the most efficient employee with the least efficient employee, and how am I kind of figuring out like what is reasonable when people have different personal capacities, and how am I adjusting for that? How am I adjusting if someone has a death in their family or a medical issue? How am I having conversations about workload adjustments and things like that? So those are the things that I would really be thinking about. I also think just recognizing the fawning response that is particularly high in our profession. So for example, I started a business, I have an employee, I created an unlimited PTO policy. Fantastic, right? Like, I'm like, this is going to be so flexible. This person, as long as they're like doing their work and they're communicating me, it's fine. We're going 6 months through the year, and I'm like, this person has not taken any days off. Like, they haven't taken a single day off. And I had to kind of actually recognize that I was working with someone who struggled more to ask for their needs to be met. And even though I created a policy that had maximum flexibility, I'm encountering a human being that might struggle in setting some boundaries for themselves. So I had to adjust my policy to make an unlimited PTO policy with a minimum mandatory that you had to take off, right? So I'm building in the boundaries. So we want to create a boundary respecting culture and make sure that we're not just saying that in our interviews, we're not just saying that flippantly, but like when it's inconvenient, when it's difficult, we are acting out those promises, and we're modeling those by also kind of enforcing our own boundaries.
Oh, I think that's such a great example. Okay, we've looked at individual level burnout, and we've looked a little bit at the system level burnout. And like I said, I think this is something that afflicts so many in our sector. So this is going to be such an important episode. Shaina, if people want to learn more, where can they find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn at Shaina Siber Sanderwitz. I can give that over to you because I have a long, full last name. AFFIRM Mental Health is where I have a continuing education program. If you are in need of CEs, feel free to check that out. And check out the Affirming Minds podcast. So yeah, between AFFIRM Mental Health and the Affirming Minds podcast, those are great ways to connect. Feel free to message me. I always love to connect with other, therapists and other, people interested in mental health topics. So.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Self-Carapist Therapist. I hope today's conversation gave you insight, clarity, or a tool you can take straight into your clinical work. If you found this episode helpful, be sure to subscribe to the show on YouTube and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps other therapists find the show and keeps these conversations going. Until next time, keep learning, stay curious, and take care of yourself too.